Welcome, everybody. I want to thank Susan Fisher for suggesting this topic and getting microphones that work without feedback. Last time we had some karaoke. And my guest is Peter Asaro. He's associate professor at the New School of Media Studies and vice chair of the campaign to stop killer robots. In addition, he's co-founder and co-chair of the International Committee for Robots Arms Control. He works on the human rights issues surrounding targeted killing by drones, arms control issues for autonomous lethal robotics.
David, hold it closer.
Closer? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Better?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay, good. So, welcome. So, how has the use of drones impacted modern warfare?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. This is lovely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about drones. I did a lot of work on drones quite a while ago, and I've been looking more at autonomous weapon systems. So I'll talk a little bit about the differences of those things. Ooh, that's crazy acoustics when the speaker starts playing. Okay. But it's probably helpful to get a little bit of context historically as to what we mean by drones, where they came from, how are they used in warfare. They've actually been used for a very long time. A drone kind of just is any kind of remote control. Usually it's an aircraft, but it could be a boat, it could be a small ground vehicle, it could be a submarine. They have a lot of different names now. We also call them like unoccupied vehicles or unmanned or uncrewed or all these different sorts of terms that have popped up. But the basic idea is you're operating them remotely, but there's a human operator. It's kind of like a fancy remote control airplane. But there's also now the ability to control these things through software and computer programs. So there isn't an actual human flying them and controlling them. And that raises a whole sort of other set of issues. But their use in the military also goes back quite a ways. They were used all the way back in World War II. They would take World War I aircraft and fly them remotely for pilot training, so pilots could practice shooting down airplanes. Their actual use in combat really started with Israel in the 1960s. Used them to basically flew into Israel ahead of manned aircraft, and then all the anti-aircraft would go off and shoot down the drones, so that when the manned aircraft came in, then they didn't have any anti-aircraft ammunition left. So that was really kind of the first use of them. The U.S. military used them mostly for target practice, for most of that period until really the 1980s. They started using them more for what they call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, for spying on stuff. They have cameras on them, they can beam back images. If you don't know what's happening far away, you can send the drone and then it'll send back an image. And that sort of evolved over the course of the 90s to this sort of recognition, particularly when Clinton was president. There was an incident where, of course, there had been the first attack on the World Trade Center was a car bomb in the basement, and some of you might remember that. And in retaliation, Clinton sort of went after Al-Qaeda, and at that time they were already in Afghanistan, and they saw them with a drone, but the drones didn't have weapons on them, so they had to fire a missile from a ship in the Indian Ocean to sort of try to attack them. But by the time that missile got there, he'd already gone back into the cave and was hiding out, and it didn't kill Osama bin Laden. So they almost got him, I think that was like 1994, 1996-ish. So kind of, then they started thinking more about, well, if we have this drone there already, why don't we just put the missile on the drone, and then when we see Osama bin Laden, we can just hit him with the missile right away. We don't have to wait for the missile to fly 45 minutes away. So they started working on that, and then by the time they had that technology sort of working, was early 2000s. It was even actually before, that was functional before 9/11, but shortly after 9/11, it was first used actually in Yemen by George Bush. to assassinate a suspected member of Al-Qaeda who was in a car driving across the desert, and they identified him and localized him and used that. And that sort of started what we think of now really as the modern era of drone warfare. And then, of course, with the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and these long wars, these weapons went into mass production or, heavy use by the military, training up whole crews and having these things flying continuously. But it was very much based on a specific model of how the US thought about it, which was these were growing out of these very long range surveillance systems, and they would just have initially just like 2 missiles on them. That was the Predator drone, and then the successor to that was the Reaper drone, and it had like 8 missiles on it. And that took 10 years of development to get to that point. But you need like satellites and space and telecommunication networks in order to operate these things, but the pilots could be thousands of miles away. And this raised a whole lot of concerns around, what is it like to fight warfare at long distance? What are the implications of that? It also led to what we now understand as the targeted killing program, where instead of just fighting a battle on a battlefield, that we actually try to identify specific individuals who are members of terrorist organizations. And there was a theory that if you could, decapitate the leadership of those organizations, you could destroy those organizations. And so you start making targeting lists of who you think are these people, and you try to find them and target them. Empirical research over time kind of shows that actually doesn't really work. That's not how you disband terrorist organizations. Generally, if you kill the leadership of a terrorist organization, they actually become more extremist because the members sort of recognize, first of all, that they're very important, because the US sent this robot from thousands of miles away to kill their leader in the middle of the desert. So whatever that leader has been telling them must have been really important and really dangerous. So we're going to follow them. But then it also makes them more extreme, because younger leaders don't have the kind of respect and authority that the older leaders have. So they have to kind of prove themselves, and generally they do this by being more violent, more extreme, attacking more civilians and things like that. So really, you don't actually, and also the side effect of a lot of these targeted killings is there's a lot of civilian casualties. And so all the family members of those civilians who are killed by these missile strikes are ready to join up with the terror organizations to fight against whoever launched that missile. So it was really ultimately probably counterproductive, and there's pretty strong evidence to that. And that's been the model that the US has sort of projected for drone warfare, with the next evolution of that being, okay, how do we not just control these things remotely, because in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's no anti-aircraft batteries, there's no opposing air force, they don't have particularly electronic countermeasures is what they call it, or jamming systems. So in order to fly remote control aircraft, you have to have all these radio signals that go back and forth to communicate to it and for it to send images back in a real-time situation. And if you can jam that with like radio noise, then those systems don't work anymore. And sophisticated adversaries, particularly Russia and China, have a lot of that stuff, and it works very effectively. Iraq and Afghanistan didn't. So you could fly these pretty primitive, really, systems quite easily. And now, if you want to fight with these kinds of weapons against those kinds of adversaries, they're not going to work. So you have to figure out, how are you going to control these things? So one idea is you make them autonomous and things like that. But it's still this kind of model of a big system being operated from far away. In the last few years, so then there was also a lot of speculation about how all of this is going to evolve over time within the Pentagon, within other circles, and I can kind of come back to the autonomous weapons stuff, but just kind of following the drone trajectory. The last few years, we've seen some pretty major conflicts, primarily in Israel and in Ukraine, that have really pushed these technologies forward in ways that are very different than the way the US has been pursuing them for the last 20 years. So in Ukraine, what we see is the evolution of a lot of small drones, kind of DIY drones. And we actually saw some of this already with ISIS operating in Iraq, using small commercial drones and just putting improvised explosives, grenades, plastic explosives, things like that, and then just trying to fly them into US forces or allied forces, things like that. We also saw in Libya in the revolution there that deposed Gaddafi and the aftermath of that, a lot of improvised use of these things, including just buying like Radio Shack, remote control cars, putting a bomb on it and trying to like drive that into your enemy, or any kind of off the shelf technology. But also in this period, a lot of military contractors, suppliers, developers have been developing weapon systems all over the world. The proliferation of drones was incredibly rapid, even though Israel, US, and just a handful of countries really had even surveillance drones in 2000. By 2010, probably 50 countries had it, and by 2020, 160 countries have this technology, and of those, maybe 10 or 15 have armed versions of these technologies. Many of those are being proliferated by countries like the US, who sells it to their friends to use for other things. China basically copycats everything that they see, but also your big military powers who produce weapons like Russia. Others like Turkey have also been highly productive, and Israel sort of leads in the development of a lot of these technologies, and there's dozens of military drone companies, or at least a dozen in Israel. So these things have been, not just those countries that produce it, but they sell them to many other countries. So they're proliferated very rapidly, which is concerning when we think about like where this goes down the road with other kinds of like autonomous technologies. But with the Ukraine war, we've seen kind of a rapid escalation of development and in new directions that we might not have expected, especially if we just sort of extrapolated what the US was doing or what other states were doing before that conflict.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Are there any rules about using drones?
So all weapons, in one way or another, sort of fall under international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict, as they're called. So this is things like the Geneva Conventions. And under the Geneva Conventions, there are certain protocols, about surrendering, how you treat prisoners of war, and things like that. But there are also specific statements about new weapon systems, and particularly Article 36 of the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions states that any weapons that are used by a state have to be sort of reviewed and evaluated to comply with the rest of the Geneva Convention, and in particular that they do not have indiscriminate or disproportionate effects. So the main sort of concept of both just war theory, which is this sort of long-standing philosophical theory of the morality of war, which goes back to some say Cicero, but certainly to Aquinas and some other philosophers who were really sort of justifying the Crusades, like how could the Pope send Christians to war because killing is not permitted? Well, if you have the right cause and you're doing it for the right reasons, and then like you're not like killing the wrong people, you're only killing the enemies, like then it's okay, right? So this sort of evolves over several centuries into this philosophical idea of just war theory, which is based on these three pillars. So you have discrimination, which is that you only kill enemy combatants and not civilians. And then the other one is proportionality, which is, well, sometimes we're going to kill civilians, but if it's proportionate, it's okay, right? And this comes into this doctrine of double effect, is what it's called. So if you intend to kill enemy combatants, but you sort of accidentally kill civilians, that's okay. But even if you know you're going to kill civilians, but you're trying only to kill the combatants, that can also be okay. And this goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's kind of a central pillar of how international law is also founded. So it's okay to, target any kind of military objective, but you have a moral obligation and a legal obligation to minimize civilian casualties, to try to avoid them whenever possible, and to do actually everything in your sort of reasonable capacity to do so, to avoid those impacts. But if you deliberately target civilians, even if it's for a military goal or a political goal, that is prohibited. And so international law sort of follows this general principle. So this gives you sort of proportionality, discrimination, and the other one is called military necessity, which is the thing you're targeting you actually need to target. Like, you can't just sort of willfully kill things, especially this comes in, like, if you know there's going to be a ceasefire or a truce or an armistice tomorrow, you shouldn't just sort of try to kill as many enemies today as possible, because they're not really going to be a threat to you after tomorrow, because there'll be a ceasefire. So, you want to prevent any current threats, but that's always sort of modulated by these other things. And then there's all these other kinds of conditions, like not killing injured soldiers. So once a soldier is what they call in French hors de combat, not like an hors d'oeuvre, but out of conflict, out of battle, right? You're not actually trying to kill, you're just trying to take the enemy soldiers out of the fight. So that's why also you can't kill prisoners of war or soldiers who are surrendering and things like that. And then there's a whole sort of complex set of rules and guidelines really around what are sometimes called partisans or guerrillas or irregular soldiers, or essentially what the International Committee of the Red Cross calls them, civilians directly participating in conflict. So if you are a civilian but you take up arms at a moment for one side or another of a battle, in a battle, you can be targeted lawfully. There is a difference though, because when you put down your weapon and you go back home, you're no longer a combatant, you go back to kind of being a civilian. So there's a lot of complexity in terms of what constitutes participation. Generally, you have to be taking orders from a military organization, you have to be serving a military function, and this is sometimes debated. So if you're just working in an arms factory, building weapons for the military, you are in fact targetable, right? So if Al-Qaeda during the or if the Taliban during the war in Afghanistan decided to bomb a factory building bombs for the U.S. military in Nevada, that would be totally legal under the laws of war, right? Even though it's full of civilians. But those are civilians directly participating in armed conflict because they're supplying weapons to the U.S. military. If you're doing surveillance and you're scouting out, targeting locations, and we're essentially a spy, right, for this military, like that's a function. It's less clear, and probably we shouldn't allow, if you're making material, financial contributions to a military, because in a sense, we all pay taxes into the U.S. military. If you pay taxes in the United States, thus you are contributing to the U.S. military, but that should not make you targetable under international law. But that justification was often used in Afghanistan for targeting individuals who were aiding the Taliban or things like that financially, or purely financially. So a lot of these things are sort of norms or ideas that are international law, but they haven't really been tested in courts. And a lot of things depend on how a court might eventually decide it. So we don't really know, but at least what's written, and then the ICRC, maybe the Red Cross will offer legal guidance on a lot of these things. So that gets pretty complicated, but back to the answer to your question, Article 36 says you're supposed to review these weapons to whether or not they comply to the rule of war, the laws of war. And to do that, basically you just have to say they can at least be used in some discriminate and proportionate way. And if they can't, then they're illegal per se under Article 36 review. And that's a pretty low bar to meet, right? This is basically like a weapon you just can't control at all. And you can't prevent it from killing civilians, then it would be prohibited. But if you look at a rifle, well, of course a rifle can kill civilians, but you can also target it precisely and not kill civilians. So they're permissible. Which doesn't mean they're always used that way. It just means in theory or in principle you could use it in a discriminate way.
So what's the ideal use of drones? I mean,
Is it so to spare casualties of soldiers? Or like you said, to send, or have the enemy, bomb something that's not really an airplane coming for them?
Yeah, so it's a technology and it has a lot of different functions. Particularly the way the U.S. used them, they're, again, primarily surveillance, and then you can put weapons on them. But something that rarely gets talked about in the press is that they're also routers. Right? They're Wi-Fi connections for all the troops on the ground, because if you don't have satellites overhead and you don't have a bunch of radio antennas around, where are you going to get your internet? Right? And in fact, these things are perfect places to set up your Wi-Fi from. So they're actually serving this function as well. But it's kind of whatever the military thinks they want to do with it. And you could use these in a lot of different ways. And what they think they want to do with them underwater or on the surface of the water can be very different than what they're going to do with them in the air. They're typically in the air or in the water because there's not a lot of obstacles. It's kind of easy to fly them around. Once you take off or land, right, that's the hard part. And once it's in the air, the computer can kind of fly it pretty easily on its own, and you can just give it GPS waypoints, and it just goes where you want it to go. And then when you want to actually survey something or shoot something, then you kind of take over and you can control it like that. But then it's like, so what are they used for and why are they important? So initially they were thinking very much about this targeted killing, but then they found actually they're really useful for all kinds of things. So the main one is like ground support for troops. So if you have troops on the ground, having aircraft overhead enhances their power a lot, helps defend them a lot, but it's also very expensive. Like planes burn through fuel very quickly, so you can't really have a plane overhead very long. And like in Vietnam, they're going to fly in, they're going to drop some bombs, they're going to turn around and go home. That's about it. And even today, jet fighters, they can fly for maybe an hour and a half before they run out of gas, and then they either have to refuel in the air or land and refuel, and so they're not persistent, right? And these little drones, so the first generation Predator drone literally used a snowmobile engine, and they filled the wings with gas, and the thing can fly for 36 hours. So an hour and a half versus 36 hours. So that sort of changes your whole perspective on like what kinds of operations you can use these for. And so long-term surveillance and trying to understand patterns of life on the ground and figure out what people are doing, and then try to identify, well, who are the militants or the enemies in this group, and then target them, became a new way of sort of thinking and using these systems. Some of the long-range surveillance drones, so they have this one called Global Hawk. It can fly for 72 hours, right? So, but it's only doing surveillance. It doesn't have any weapon systems. And then there's now we have these small drones. So in the meantime, over the last decade, you might have heard of DJI and these little quadrotors that you see, buzzing around in the park. Right. These have become very sophisticated, and they're evolving at a very rapid rate. So they have an 18-month evolutionary cycle. So every 18 months, a new generation of these are coming out. They're mostly DJI is based in Hong Kong, which is now sort of part of China, but they're all manufactured in China and Shenzhen. And their servers are there, so there's been some question of where does all this data go? But they have very sophisticated GPS. So basically they have taken all the technology that's in here and became really, really cheap and used that to make these little quadrotors super effective. So it used to be really hard to fly a remote control helicopter. Very, very difficult. In fact, the president of the New York remote control helicopter club was killed by his own helicopter in the Bronx because he flew it into himself. So yeah, it's not easy to fly. They're not very stable. But if you just put some circuits in there with gyros, because when you tilt your phone, your phone knows it's tilting, right? So that's a little electro gyro that's in there. It also has a camera, and it also has Wi-Fi, and it also has tons of memory, and it also has all the computational power you need to fly a little quadrotor. Because all you have to do is sort of balance these 4 rotors to tilt and rotate and spin around, and they're super highly efficient at that. And so that was kind of a big deal. I don't know, 2012 or so, these things started appearing. But now it's you have all this computational power, you could do all these other things. So you have Instagram influencers who are gonna use these things to okay, I can lock it on an image of myself, and now I can mountain bike down this mountain, or I can ski down this mountain, or I can drive my fancy car down this windy road, and it just follows me. And it can keep up, and it recognizes my image. And that's still 7 or 8 years ago. That's just built-in technology. They have a built-in obstacle avoidance. And they're developing ever more sophisticated things that are just kind of built into this technology. So these are actually really sophisticated, even by military standards. kinds of maneuverability and operational capacity. So when the war really started in Ukraine, it really started in 2014, but in the invasion in 2022, what we saw was the mobilization of a lot of DIY drone clubs who were initially just using them for surveillance to see like where the armored columns were coming down the highway towards Kiev. So there were real-time reports on all of that. And these are small, they only fly for about 30 minutes tops on a battery charge, and then you gotta recharge them. So they're not super long range. But they're small, they're fast. It's very hard for traditional military hardware to really stop them. Like you can't just knock them out of the sky very easily. You can shoot at them, and if you can hit them, like you'll probably knock them out of the sky, but they move pretty fast and they're really small. So it's not that easy, actually. And even some Predator drones got shot down by rifles in Iraq at like 1,500 feet. So it's possible. But then they were like, well, yeah, but they're not weaponized. How do we weaponize that? And just like we saw in ISIS and Iraq, they started figuring out, okay, here's ways, mechanisms we can build that will drop a grenade or some kind of small explosive or various things. And it's interesting to me because that sort of decade before that, a lot of people, say the Pentagon think tanks, were like, how are all these small drones and big drones going to change the future of warfare? And there's all these very sci-fi, Star Trek, like visions of the future of warfare. There's no people around, it's just these robots fighting. And then we see what is probably the most sophisticated drone warfare currently on Earth happening in the Ukraine. And it's brought warfare back to World War I. It's become trench warfare and artillery warfare, and it's largely because of the capabilities of these drones. Because you can see enemy troop movements, you can see when they're in the trenches, you can find the artillery and the armored, and you can send these little drones out, and the drones can carry a big enough explosive to take out a tank. Tanks are very expensive, especially sophisticated ones. They can cost millions of dollars. These little drones cost a few $100s. And so if you can take out a multi-million-dollar tank with a $100 drone, that changes the nature of warfare, right? And this is a big part of why Ukraine has been able to stop the Russian advance. But of course, Russia also has these kinds of technologies, and they're thinking about that and trying to produce it. I think, in many ways, the sanctions, that economic sanctions that the West put on Russia really stopped their ability to acquire the chips, the stuff that's in here, very effectively, and really definitely the more sophisticated ones that you need for bigger kinds of military hardware, which has really limited their ability to mass produce little drones or drone weapons. And so what we've seen is that they've gone to Iran to acquire these Shiad drones, and those are the ones that they're using to bomb housing complexes in Kiev and Kharkiv and places like this. And now they're also sort of running out of ammunition for their artillery, so they're like going to North Korea to get this kind of stuff. But Ukraine really sort of started a program quite quickly after the beginning of the war to ramp up drone production. And there's been some recent articles, if you've seen them in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, New Yorker, have all had articles about what's happening behind the scenes. There's a huge initiative. They're like, we're going to make 500,000 drones a month. Like we're just gonna, like that's our goal, right? Right now they're about 500,000 a year, but they started out, they weren't making any drones, right? And then within a year they're making 100,000 drones a year, and now they're making, 40,000 drones a month, according to these articles. And those are just the sort of basic platform. Then you have all this innovation of, there's a lot of young people, there's a lot of young programmers in Ukraine. It's a specific kind of population, which you didn't see in Afghanistan and Iraq. There weren't a lot of young hackers playing with drones when the US invaded in those places, but there are in Ukraine. And so they're developing software to control these things. They're developing 3D printed additions to these drones that can hold different kinds of grenades and other kinds of munitions so they can be dropped on enemy troops. And so that evolutionary cycle has moved really, really quickly.
Someone asked me before we started, am I going to feel better after this talk or more nervous? So which is it?
Hopefully more nervous. If I've done my job, we will be very, very nervous. is. Which kind of comes, yeah, so what should you be nervous about? So in one sense, this isn't a fundamentally different kind of warfare. It's not fundamentally unethical to use drones instead of artillery to kill soldiers who are invading your country. Like, the ethics and the laws are pretty much the same. The concern that we have in trying to ban autonomous weapons is we think there's a big moral and legal leap from remote control to autonomy. So the main leap is who's making these decisions, how are these decisions being made? And we justify, as I said, in just war theory, the killing in war. And that's a moral foundation based in collective self-defense, just like you can defend yourself if somebody attacks you. Your country can collectively defend itself if another country attacks you. This is a sort of fundamental moral and legal right. However, for you to actually kill somebody in any particular case, you need moral justification for that, right? You can't just kill anybody and say, well, we're at war. Well, it has to be the enemy, and it has to be because they're threatening you, and it has to be because they invaded you, and it's a just war, and all these other things. And you have to be a rational agent who sort of understands all of that. Computers are not that, right? They are just following a program. There's also these very specific requirements about not hurting, combatants who are hors de combat, or surrendering, or injured on the battlefield, things like that. How is the computer going to make these distinctions? It doesn't know what those things are. So it doesn't necessarily know, even if it can recognize enemy combatants and distinguish those from civilians, it doesn't know which ones it's allowed to kill or why it's allowed to kill them. So it's not making a moral judgment. It's not making a legal judgment. You can just program it to kill people. And we do this in certain ways with guided missiles and other things, but humans are always the ones making the decision of what is a target, and they have the legal and moral responsibility for that decision. So if it goes wrong, they should be held accountable. But if you're allowing a computer program to make that, and the humans who send it out don't know what it's going to do, who's responsible? Well, in some sense, the people who sent it out are kind of responsible, but they really don't know what it's going to do. And under international laws of war crimes, just like in murder, you have to prove intent, right? The difference between manslaughter and murder is like that you've intentionally killed somebody. So there has to be what they call mens rea, that you've thought about and intend to kill somebody. You send out a system that you don't know what it's going to do. There's no mens rea. You don't know what it's going to do. That's recklessness. That's negligence under the law, but that's not intentional killing. So in that sense, like what we think of as a traditional war crime would be incredibly difficult to prosecute against anybody using a system like that. And this is a sort of responsibility or accountability gap. Anytime you kind of automate these processes, you have this inability to then hold humans accountable in a way for what these systems do. In a larger sense, of course, you can say, well, the state of whatever country it is did this, and we're going to hold them accountable. But that's a different kind of accountability, and that's more about international standing, international relations.
I'm going to open this up to our audience for questions. Just raise your hand and.
So true, and the Russians are using drones now to chase civilians down the street, aren't they? Or there are some articles in the Times talking about how they're...
I haven't seen that. I mean, they are using drones.
There was one last week, actually, where they were talking about... so it makes it easier to commit war crimes, I guess, right? Like you can...
Yeah, well, it certainly does. I mean, I don't know that specific case. I was traveling last week, maybe I missed it, but they're definitely using drones, and they're using them mostly as like long-range missiles or long-range artillery, something more like a GPS coordinate that's guiding it, rather than a control system on board the drone that's like trying to identify a person and chase them down. Now, I mentioned the Turkish systems that were used in Libya, and those actually have, just like we have, face recognition. So if you hold your phone up to your face, you can like unlock it. You might have seen something like that. So you can program face recognition or human form, sort of body recognition, into these systems. And Turkey has done this with this particular system, and they were used in Libya, and there was a report about this a couple of years ago from the UN. And basically they do what you're saying, which is like identify humans, and sort of like a flying landmine, they just fly after the person they see and blow up and kill that person. So these are called Tarkus. So they exist, but they also have a mode, like you can switch them between that kind of autonomous mode and then this remote mode where there's actually a pilot flying them. So a real challenge for us, because we monitor all this stuff and we're always looking for usage and trying to interpret like what's happening, what's getting used. We aren't a huge organization, so we don't have people on the ground who can really go do forensics. And a lot of what shows up in social media is very suspect. And we've seen reports for decades or more about, oh, Russia used an autonomous tank in Syria, or oh, there's this thing in Azerbaijan. And some of that is sort of loosely related to reality, and a lot of it is sort of hype. So you can't really tell when you see a little drone flying around, is it being flown by a program or is it being flown by a pilot? So it could be one or the other. And as far as I know, like Russia isn't using those types of drones to like chase people down, but it could be. In another sense, like Ukraine is, but they're using it against these soldiers in trenches primarily. And there's been a whole slew of videos on the internet about this, and a lot of them like chasing down North Korean soldiers. So they had a whole article a couple of weeks ago about the North Korean soldiers who were fighting in Russia against the Ukrainian forces, and there's videos of them fighting these drones.
Oh, okay. Wait, Diana, go ahead and then I'll go.
Okay. So fast forwarding, how do you think about the implications of AGI and kind of ASI, you know, artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence on drone warfare?
Yeah, well, so this idea, for those who aren't familiar with it, like AGI, artificial general intelligence, or some kind of super intelligence, that you could build an AI that will be kind of smarter than us, or in some sense all-knowing, or some kind of self-growing mind of some sort. Yeah, something along those lines. I'm not terribly worried about that, mostly because, yeah, we really don't know how to do anything close to that right at this point. It's possible. If you think it's possible, then you definitely don't want to have a bunch of autonomous weapons around that this superintelligence could take control of. Like, that seems like a really bad idea. So if that's what you're afraid of is AGI, then you definitely want to get rid of autonomous weapons.
It's coming. I mean, to say that, okay, you know, whether we believe in it or not, I mean, it's coming. That's what OpenAI is working on. So whether it's...
Yeah, they're working on the like large language model, which I did a lot of research on in graduate school. They're really interesting, and they can do fascinating things, but they're essentially really sophisticated models of language that can produce outputs that are very convincing, but also not very reliable. They have tons of problem with reasoning. They can't do arithmetic. They can't do basic logic. We might be able to fix those problems. But at this point, also, they don't really have a will. They're not trying to do anything other than execute the code that we're giving them. And it's not really clear like what's required to move beyond that. And just making them bigger isn't going to do that.
So I have a question. I have two questions. One is these drones that can last for 36, 48 hours, how far can they go from the base? So it's great that they can be up in the air. How far can they travel across an ocean? And
yeah, so maybe I'll answer a slightly different question, but as far as you want, it really depends on the kind of platform, right? And so,
I mean, do they need a signal from the mother base, or can they just, you know, can they be controlled by satellites, or whatever?
yes and no, right? So maybe, so they can be a lot of different things, and you can have an aircraft style one that flies for 62 hours, 72 hours, whatever, and like you want a radio link to it to control it. You could make it autonomous. you can, like, autopilots are actually flying most of the airliners most of the time. They're landing and taking off most of the time. Like, this is a well-known technology. It's very reliable. It's just a matter of how do you navigate and how do you execute some kind of military mission. And that's where you want some kind of input. Now, you can pre-program certain things. And if you think about even a cruise missile, like they were trying to assassinate bin Laden with in 1996, like they shot that from hundreds of miles away with a GPS coordinate programmed into it, and it flew close to the ground and then went to that coordinate. He just wasn't there anymore. So you don't have like the ability to get more information back from it and then change where it's going to go. And that's sort of the advantage and disadvantage of autonomy. Autonomy lets you like operate from without being able to control, send a signal or get a signal back. On the other hand, you can't send a signal or get a signal back, so you can't call it off, you can't redirect it, you can't gain additional information from it. Where this is also very crucial is undersea, because radio waves don't travel under salt water. So there's certain very limited forms of sonar communication that exist, but essentially submarines are not in communication when they're below the surface of the water. You can also have like floating routers and things like that. It's kind of complicated, but for the most part, like undersea operations. And this is really where a lot of things are happening right now in the military domain. There's a lot of contestation of the North Pole, of the South China Sea. Most of it is actually happening under the surface of the water. There's tons of drones, like China's capturing US drones in the South China Sea on a regular basis. We're capturing, Russian drones under the polar ice caps all the time. Like, these things are happening a lot. And you can't communicate with them when they're down. When they surface, they'll like beam all their data to a satellite and then they'll like go back down. So you kind of get these periodic things. And then there's a whole range of like things that even go into space, like intercontinental ballistic missiles, which have been around since the Cold War. They go into space and they come back, and in a sense, like, they're remote operated things. To what extent can you call one back or not changes. In that domain, there's a lot of discussion now, like hypersonic missiles and things that travel 4 to 5 times the speed of sound, which changes a lot of these dynamics of nuclear deterrence, because this idea that you can like make a response to a first strike because you have enough time to know missiles are coming at you, that you can shoot your missiles back. But if missiles are going to show up here in 5 to 10 minutes after launch, that changes really dramatically. And the other one is this sort of undersea nuclear delivery, which Russia has developed the technology for, essentially sending torpedoes, from St. Petersburg to New York underwater that you can't really detect in any way. It takes a while. They're not super fast. But if they show up in, in Verrazano, we're in trouble.
Back there?
Yeah, so my question was, and of course Scientific American, so this is a journalism question too. When it comes to how do we evaluate which publications we can trust on these issues, because I write a lot about healthcare myself, and there are a lot of things that I almost feel purposely scare people, and it may not be as well researched or factually based, or have kind of its own preconceived slant. So where do you recommend, for both of you, like where do you recommend people read, or at least like if you don't want to recommend specific publications, what are the clues that it is fair reporting that you really should trust?
Great question. And I know I'm talking to some science journalists here, so I'm going to be very careful in my answer. So I think a lot of like where the best information on these sorts of things is coming from is not necessarily journalism itself in all cases. Now, in the case of like Ukraine, like the stuff I was talking about, all of that came from really excellent reporting from reliable journalists with editors that make sure that there's sources and things like that. So Wall Street Journal, New York Times, but they're getting accounts from soldiers of sort of what's happening on the ground. If you really want to understand how the technology works, because they don't really report on that part of it, I am typically going to trusted think tanks who work in the disarmament, arms control, international relations domain. So STEMSEN Center or CIPRI is a Swedish-based organization that monitors arms trade and arms development. You can look at UNIDIR is the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. Like these are the places where things are carefully researched, vetted. It's not going to be the Daily Post of like what happened yesterday kind of journalism, but a lot of them have blogs. Like the ICRC has a blog and CIPRI has a blog, and you know these organizations also have kind of updates on stuff. But I think, you know, what you consider traditional journalism is usually pretty good for a certain thing. Like, I don't necessarily go there to find out.
Wired magazine.
Wired has been pretty good, yeah. Wired's good for the tech side of things. But there's so much hype, right? And even when I talk to these journalists, which I talk to them quite regularly, and I say things, and then you see the article, and you're like, oh, like, they're hyping it, right? They're... You know, there's a degree to which that's good, that you do want to kind of wake people up because there are real threats here. On the other hand, like it doesn't need to be overblown necessarily. Maybe in certain cases it does. I mean, it's hard to say, like, what's too much hype? Definitely too much hype in AI.
Go ahead.
Is this the technology that the Houthis are using in Yemen off of the coast to attack the Mediterranean shipping fleets?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what they're using. We're definitely using it to attack them.
Trying to.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
So does all this depend on satellites is a good question. Yes and no, right? It did for a very long time, and most of these big systems do, because you have to at least have GPS, right? And somebody may have used that to get here today, like me. But they have other systems that don't rely on it. And so GPS, if you're not aware, is a satellite system. So there's a number of geosynchronous satellites, and your phone talks to them to figure out where you are on the surface of the planet. Which also makes them susceptible to space-based attacks if we take out the satellites, or if we have so much satellite junk and all the satellites start running into each other and create a debris field and just going to destroy all the satellites. That's most likely going to happen in a fairly short time frame, like the next decade. We won't have satellites anymore. They're just putting way too many into space, and they're not tracking them. And any satellite-based weapons, anti-satellite weapons, are just going to... It creates a chain reaction, just like a nuclear reaction. So one shatters, then the pieces go and shatter more, and it creates more pieces and shatters more, and it'll take a long time for all that stuff to fall out of orbit. But they do have, like, for navigational purposes in particular, there's what's called inertial navigation. So it's kind of like the gyro, but you get them so precise that it actually knows how fast it's going and how much it's accelerating and in what relation to gravity and north and these other factors, that you can do, you know, this kind of dead reckoning based on inertial navigation. And those are super sophisticated, very expensive. China's constantly trying to steal them from the US, that sort of level of... But if you can do that, then you can operate even in jamming situations. And you may remember quite a while ago now, Iran captured a US, a very sophisticated, the most sophisticated, and at that time, totally top secret surveillance drone. It was a stealth surveillance drone. And they did it by inserting themselves into the GPS system, because you can pretend to be a GPS satellite. And this is called spoofing. And you fly your planes next to the drone, and then you spoof and pretend to be that satellite. And then you say, okay, it thinks it's on this trajectory flying to this location, so now we're just going to recalibrate the signals from the GPS to make it think that it's doing that, but actually we're like landing it. So they just sort of crash landed it into the desert, and then they had all this super sophisticated technology.
Talk about, so what role did Starlink play in Ukraine?
A huge role. So their military is almost completely dependent on Starlink for communications and for controlling. They use a lot of other kinds of drones than these drones, but even these drones, A lot of them are just direct radio signals, so you don't necessarily need a satellite system to communicate. But the longer range stuff, and you may have heard, like they sunk the flagship of the Black Sea Armada of Russia, right? I think it was even called the Moscow ship. And they did that with a boat-style drone on the sea, and they used satellites to like drive it into this boat. Without those satellites, they couldn't do it.
I think that was Neptune missile that sank Moscow. They sank other smaller ships
with
naval drones.
naval drones, yeah.
And
Thank
who
you.
owns Who owns
Oh, Elon Musk owns Starlink, and Starlink has so far put like 30,000 satellites in orbit, I think, or 10,000.
Yeah, I think it's.
So they're aiming to. That's their goal.
Yeah.
But pretty soon that's not gonna be relevant, right? You're saying that pretty soon.
Well, if they all start crashing into each other, then it could very rapidly become a debris field. It's also already creating a lot of light pollution for astronomers. So ground-based telescopes are becoming much less effective at doing deep space research because there's so much reflection from these satellites.
Go ahead.
Just to take a contrarian view, can a case be made for this? It keeps, drones keep the good guys out of the cockpits and out of harm's way. If we have superior technology, again, we fancy ourselves the good guys, so the good guys win, or is there simply escalation of technology? So we have it, and the Russians have it, and the Chinese have it, and everything neutralizes itself because everybody is equivalent on the battlefield.
So well, on the one hand, like yes, like and no, and maybe. So the first question is there a case to be made? And there's definitely a case to be made. Like they do protect troops. Like not being in the cockpit is very valuable to not being killed when the thing gets shut down, right? Whether ultimately that's the best way of warfare or what are the implications for civilian casualties really depends on how you use it. So like the targeted killing program seems like a very illegal sort of program, but you can also use that same system to support troops in very traditional military operations that are quite legal if you use it in the right way. And this comes to that kind of Article 36. Like it can be used discriminately, and so it's not in principle a bad technology, and in a lot of ways it's beneficial, and we've seen that in Ukraine, that it's been used very effectively to defend against a force that otherwise would be far superior in terms of tanks and artillery. But that technological advantage has allowed them to maintain their border to some extent. So there are advantages to using it. There is also the yes and is, yeah, everybody's developing this technology, so you get a sort of first mover advantage, but the idea that you're going to maintain that advantage for any period of time is sort of an illusion, and we know this already, and these are the kind of arms races that we're already seeing. So the proliferation of these systems has been incredibly rapid, unlike, like, say, other technologies. Like if you think, a big deal in the 80s Afghan war was, shoulder-launched rockets and anti-aircraft and anti-armored things that the U.S. was kind of supplying to the Taliban then. And those had a huge effect on Russia, and it's been very hard for states to build that kind of technology. That actually hasn't proliferated nearly as fast as the drones have, which again is mostly because of these things. So proliferation is huge, and then you have the sort of escalation and advancement of technology. So part of that is, it's actually really hard to do it the way the US does it, right? It's really expensive and difficult to build a fighter jet or an aircraft carrier or these 72-hour, 1,000-mile range drones. But if you just want to build a little drone and fly it over that hill and blow up something in a trench, like that's pretty easy. And that's accessible commercial technology that's in mass production, super cheap, easily modifiable. And then you can use this sort of network of hackers and DIYers who just do it on their own and figure it out. And you don't need this huge military industrial complex doing lots of expensive things and testing and stuff to make that happen. And so your innovation cycles get really fast. And so that can grow very, very rapidly. Now, whether that results in any kind of balance between states, And I've been arguing this with the Pentagon for many years, that the thing they should be worried about is all these little droney things, right? Because they've put all of their resources into these big aircraft carriers and fighter jets and things that might be neutralized by these little things. And this is exactly what we saw in Ukraine, that your $1 million tanks get taken out by $100 drones. And they caught on to this, and now they have this program to also build and scale up mass-produced drones, thinking very much about the South China Sea conflict.
Back there?
Yeah, you mentioned evidence that speaks against the use of targeted strikes against terrorist leaders. I was wondering, what has our government's response to this been?
Not much.
Okay.
I mean, it was sort of a strange program because it's sort of outside of the military to a certain extent. It's mostly been run by the CIA. So a lot of what's publicly accessible knowledge is like how the military operates and these sort of things. So these drones are often military drones, but they would literally like shift control from the Pentagon to Langley when they wanted to do one of these strikes, and then they'll like switch it back because it's just like remote control, and you can like take over the controls in like different places in the world at any given time. So they had their theory, right? One about like what this war was about and how you're gonna like reshape the Middle East or something. And then there's theories about, well, if you want to get rid of Al Qaeda, like take out the leadership. And to some extent, right, like you get advantage to that, but in other ways, like you don't, right? And we've seen this, and actually this program Target Killing was really started by Israel in the 90s against Hamas and other forces in Gaza and West Bank. And they've used that, they've targeted lots of leaders over many years, and done so recently, and they've also targeted the Hezbollah leaders. But those organizations, it looks like it worked more in Hezbollah, because there seemed to be somewhat in disarray at this point. But in Hamas, it's just kind of made a lot more people angry, and there's a lot of leaders ready to step in and take over that fight. And so you've just sort of made the adversary more extremist, and you've recruited a lot more support for them within the population, and it's counterproductive at that level. And especially sustained over years, it becomes very counterproductive.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions. Back there.
So one of the most interesting stories I've read from World War II was when British airplanes dropped these aid with portraits of Prince Philip onto these tribal islands, and they ended up worshipping the prince as a deity. And so I was wondering, now that there are all of these drones flying in the sky, if there have been some observable psychological impact of just the blue sky now harboring enemies from above.
Definitely, very good question. So it's manifested in a few different ways. In the first Gulf War in the 90s, and this is when the US was still just using drones for surveillance, when they flew in, some of the Iraqi forces tried to surrender to the drone. Because they wave the white flag and they're like, don't shoot us, don't blow us up. So there is like the sense that it is somehow a presence, a person or an entity. And there's been quite extensive studies of both Gaza and Waziristan and Pakistan, where there's been a lot of drone strikes over a long period of time. And incredible amounts of psychological stress induced by that. And particularly in Waziristan, where you have, you can hear these things. You're up in the mountains, and even though they're 1,500 feet up, like they're just kind of buzzing around, which is also why they call them drones, because they sound like bees. And there's also this sense of like occasionally they shoot a missile and blow up a whole building, and they don't really know why or who's being targeted. So it leads to a lot of sort of gossip and speculation of like, who is that? And often they're not members of the Taliban, because the population generally knows who the Taliban members are and who the local warlords and things are. And they would it appears quite random, like who gets killed. And so that creates a sort of form of terror, right? This sort of just, people just get randomly blown up in your neighborhood. And then it's there, and it's there for 24 hours before it flies away. So there was also initially it was reported and then later confirmed that like people became terrified of cell phones and SIM cards in particular. And actually Al Qaeda knew that they were being targeted by their SIM cards or suspected it, and it turns out they were, because it's a radio signal that you can detect. And so they were using that as confirmation that this was a member of Al Qaeda because we knew they'd used this phone at some point. But Al Qaeda figured that out very early on, and so they just kept swapping the SIM cards. So this created one, it was a crisis. So the company that makes the SIM cards was actually in Denmark, and like they just couldn't make enough SIM cards because everybody's swapping SIM cards. But then like people were just passing SIM cards around in Pakistan, and so your local baker just winds up with a SIM card that used to be an Al Qaeda SIM card, and then they get targeted. And so it just created this kind of sense of, you know, doom and persistent stress.
Okay, last question.
So one of the best weapons has always been propaganda. And a friend of mine was reporting in the Ukraine and would receive text messages from Russia. And to the point where after she got enough of them, for about 2 seconds, she almost believed what Russia was saying. Can the drones be used to block signals of things coming in like that from Russia or from other places?
Interesting question. Maybe, probably not. Most of what we're getting is like the internet, right? Is Wi-Fi. So you can block radio transmission Wi-Fi localized. So you could sort of block it, but then you don't get any information. It's just like a blackout. But you can also just turn off the power, and that kind of does the same thing. But if you want to just selectively filter information, it doesn't really work for that. I also do a lot of research on propaganda and disinformation. Another complex problem, how AI fits into that is even more complicated. But what you do see is, and this kind of leads to the autonomy portion, particularly in Ukraine, is Russia does have this jamming technology, and they're localized, so they'll put it on a tank, and so for like 100 meters around the tank, like radio signals don't work. So when the drone gets close to the tank, and they used to blow up the tanks with the drones, like then it doesn't work anymore. So they're building now certain levels of autonomy, kind of like the influencer skiing down the hill. They'll take the picture of the tank, and then the drone will autonomously, for that last 100 meters, fly into the tank. And this is where we're starting to see autonomy kind of build out. But they're not launching that autonomously.
Okay, well, I want to thank Dr. Asaro. I thank Susan and Chip for hosting us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. It's been lovely.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Great questions.